immaculate Stephen McClung, redbreast, single pot, still Irish whiskey. Lots of words that I don't understand, which means, folks, this is an amazing whiskey. I can't tell you why, I just know that it is. And it has a big number on it, 12.
Oh, wow.
Those typically mean good things in regards to Scotch.
The smell is intimidating.
This week we're discussing on the Positive Perspectives Philosophy Podcast, PPPP.
If you will.
Yes.
Every time.
I guess we might need to change it to PPPP now. I mean, possibly. But no one will get that joke, hopefully. Anyway. Edit that out, please.
Never.
You got to go with the flow. You know what I'm saying?
Keep going.
We will be discussing the framework come up with by Stephen McClung in relation to Plato's hierarchy of forms. Is that what it's called? Plato's hierarchy of forms? What is the technical term for it? I always call it the cognitive schematic, because that's the way my book titled it. But I think there's more technical terms than that.
Yeah, it's often referred to as the divided line.
A divided line.
But you refer to it as the unified line.
The unified line, that's correct.
But if I may start with a question.
Of course.
How do you feel physics relates to the divided line as stated by Plato? How do you feel it relates?
Well, it was while reading the Republic and while reading Plato's description of the divided line that the correlation first struck me, that this stratification or differentiation of reality into four ascending kinds or forms, culminating in the great idea, the idea of the good, paralleled what is commonly accepted amongst physicists called the Standard Model. Standard Model says that we have 3 generations of particles, and then we have a fourth kind of particle, which is an interacting particle, and then finally we have the Higgs field and the Higgs boson, which kind of justify everything that came after it. So it's kind of the great idea of the Standard Model. So 4 things and a fifth ideal. Same thing as the divided line that Plato lays out. Images, observable things, mathematical things, ideal forms, and the idea of the good.
Yeah. And that's really interesting that there's that correlation there. And layman's question for Jacob, really.
Yeah.
Perhaps you could give a explanation of how the divided line works for Plato. At the bottom of the hierarchy,
right,
so to speak, what is there? What do we have?
Yeah, so for those not familiar with the Platonic Forms, this sort of model that he lays out in the Republic, this lowest level, really the 2 lowest levels are both physical things. And so you could almost draw a sort of boulder line in between the lower 2 and the upper 2, I guess, modes or models. So at the lowest level, there's just images. This would be things that are directly observable, that have some reality behind them, but what we actually know of them could be called an image, or even like a rendering, and maybe it's a better translation
like a
for that.
Picture of a pot with oranges in it instead of the pot of oranges itself.
Yeah.
Okay.
And Plato is really applying this to things in an almost abstract sense. And so when you say a picture, take for example Mona Lisa. Mona Lisa is a picture. And so what we could say is, while it's technically an image, it's also something on the second row. It's an observable thing.
Interesting.
It's a type of image. So it's this is going to sound weird, but it's an image of the ideal image, if you will. Now that's not really See, this is where Plato gets a little weird, because classifications are a bit arbitrary. And so for me to say ideal image is really quite arbitrary. But
it's safe to say there's some interaction between these 4 levels where it's not quite stratified, it's fluid to some degree.
It's more of how we choose to view things. So
interesting.
In Plato's construction, the only guidance we really have here is to go towards the good. And even that can be difficult since it's not something that's well defined in a mathematical sense.
Well, little background. You want to tell us a little bit about yourself, Stephen? We've been kind of rude. I apologize. I've given my background. I'm more of a poet. I went to art school, went to Meadow School of the Arts. Jacob, stalwart science background, went to a great science school, if you'd like to mention the school.
Not particularly.
Okay,
Computer
that's
science
fine.
from Texas A&M University.
Yeah, and Stephen's the same way, stalwart science background. So if you want to give a bit about yourself, I feel
Sure.
we passed
Why
over
not?
you.
I'm the special guest, Stephen, but not so special because I didn't get introduced.
are introduced now.
I'm introduced now.
We're just getting into the conversation a little bit.
Yeah, I guess so. I don't take any offense. My background is also in science primarily. I've been trained as an engineer, but I've also had now kind of extensive experience in business and management.
Hmm.
So I love the numbers and I love the people. And everything that helps me understand either or both is interesting to me. So I've said this before, I am addicted to information. I'm a data junkie. So
Nice.
I love learning and then I love to share what I learn.
Well, if I may throw another question at you then. Jacob gave us a really good flyby of the first two levels, and I guess your images and what's the second level?
Images, I'd say like physical observable things.
Yeah.
The upper two, is that where you're getting
Yeah.
towards?
What gets us from those first two levels of the hierarchy to the next two levels? A better way of saying it might be, is there any interaction between those two levels?
Absolutely. And that's probably my favorite question that we can ask about this topic, because as Jacob mentioned, there's a differentiation, a bold line. And I call it, in my mind, the bold line of reality. Jumping from the bottom two sections, either in the standard model of particle physics or in the divided line, means you're leaving that which is generally considered real to you and me. Like here in this moment, you and I, we are experiencing this, but we are not experiencing, say, our individual atoms and molecules vibrating, moving, and functioning. That's not a part of our experience. So it's outside of our reality, the reality that we perceive. And even furthermore beyond that, we have no notion in this conversation, and perhaps in any conversation, of why our atoms and our molecules are buzzing around and moving in the first place. So, crossing the bold line of reality, we are leaving observable things. We're going to something more exact, like a mathematical model. And crossing, we had the first generation of particle physics, we had the second generation of particle physics, and then suddenly, in the third generation, we start getting mathematically impossible things. So it goes from calculable to incalculable. So that's this bold line of reality jump. As we're moving towards the higher models, the higher levels, we're leaving reality. And I just love that. We're leaving reality.
That's really impressive. I mean, it's a mind-blowing thing. I almost hear like there's different academic disciplines for each level of this hierarchy.
Oh, yeah.
Is that safe to assume?
There could be. It's
something that occurred to me as he was
Yeah,
describing
it's
that.
like different. It's almost like a different field thing. Some people are interested exclusively on one level, whereas others are maybe interested on a different level exclusively. I could see that, especially like when you talk about physics. You've got theoretical physicists who are working probably all the way up in that fourth, maybe even the fifth sort of levels.
There's probably people who dedicated their entire life to the fifth.
Yeah, trying
fifth
to figure out
dimension.
what this unifying idea is. Yeah, another thing I was going to mention was when it comes to these ideal forms on this fourth level.
The ideal forms, I mean, it's tough to talk about them, and I don't know if that's necessarily a problem, because I mean, when you try to talk about an ideal form, what actually are you going to say from a Platonic perspective? Because there's an ideal form of a chair. Somewhere out there, whether it's real or not, there is a perfect chair.
Yeah. Well, it's by definition not real.
But it's by definition not real, but conceptually we can conceive of it.
Yeah.
That there has to be a perfect chair, and we conceive of an even higher perfection beyond that somewhere. How does that relate, this perfection? Is there any sort of... Is perfection even a good word when we bring physics into this?
It could be. It could be, because once we cross the bold line of reality, we move to the third generation of particle physics and the interacting particles. You could say, because we've left the realm of what we can calculate, it's become incalculable, that we've entered a realm that's above calculation. Something more basic than
more
what can be
axiomatic.
understood with a number.
Oh.
So it could be, but that would be debatable. I think it would be true to say that the ideal forms, or the fourth level, which is interacting particles, make the three levels underneath it possible. If they did not exist, the three levels underneath it wouldn't exist, even though you can't really isolate that thing.
So are you saying that the directionality of the bottom three levels is upward? Is there an upward movement inherent to this schematic of any kind?
That's kind of what we're getting at, even in those first questions we were asking. It's like, how, is it arbitrary? Is it not what you arrive at from the lower level things?
Can you avoid that upward movement?
Yeah.
It doesn't seem like you can avoid it.
I believe Plato's answer was it's not arbitrary and good is at the top. Because when he was talking about chairs and whatever else in the character of Socrates in the Republic, it was like there is a perfect thing for each situation, and that perfect thing is inherently good. And so that's how he kind of ascended the scale. Now, when we talk about the unified line in terms of physics or anything else, I'm not sure. We might be using kind of human creativity in order to ascend.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, what gave you the idea that you could tack on physics to this and make a unified line, and why pick the title, the unified line? That title just really smacks of some power. When anything is unified.
You caught me, because I chose unified very, very specifically.
Yeah.
And nobody's asked me about that yet. What first brought me to that thought? Well, I wasn't the first person to think of something like this. A scientist by the name of Heisenberg, I think, was the name. He was a German scientist who then came over to the United States, and I was instrumental in making the atomic bomb. He's the first person I could find that was quoted as having compared physics to Platonic thought. Now, he did not have the standard model sitting in front of him, but he had theoretical particle physics. That's what was just being developed.
Yeah.
So he was the first, and I couldn't find very many other people who've gone down that rabbit trail over the years. But there were a couple of clues that led me to slap these things together. One was, as you move up the divided line in Plato's model, you're moving from areas that have large portions to areas that have small portions. So I'm going to say there's so many images of a thing. For instance, me. How many pictures there are of me out in the world? A whole lot more than there are of me, right? There's tons of pictures of me. Images. There's tons of images. But if we get to the observable thing, which is me, hey, it's just one now.
So we've gone up from level 1 to level 2.
Scarcity is a thing. Moving to the next one, a mathematical model. This, generally speaking, if we were being precise, a perfect mathematical model of me would be the same size and complexity as me.
Right.
Okay? So it's identical, it's just no longer real.
Right.
That's the bold line of reality crossing.
Okay.
But then if we move from what I actually am to what I, let's say, should be, and I will not give a frame of reference for that, but if we move from what I am to what I should be, then we're narrowing. We're narrowing the vision of me.
Well, let's think it more concretely. You're narrowing from all the potential things that you are.
Yes, and all the potential things I could be.
One thing, whereas you could be a bunch of different things. All of those bunch of different things are still in the observable things realm, even if one of them is only true.
Sure.
And so in the mathematical model area, in this ideal form, I'm sorry, I'm a level lower than you were. In the mathematical model thing, there's a bunch of potential things. In the ideal thing, you're right. You're narrowing again to one
thing.
Theoretical
so
thing.
Yeah, there's just this narrowing, and then finally, you could say that the perfect version of me is based on a standard of perfect. What is that standard of perfect? Well, here we have the idea of the good. We got to the idea of the good.
I see.
Starting in physics, it's the same idea. Quarks and leptons, the first generation, that is almost all matter in the universe. It's huge. Moving to the second particle, second generation of particles, very small amount of these actually exist at any given time. Third generation of particles, practically none of these exist at any given time unless we force them to exist, which is what we do in particle accelerators. But then we move to the interacting particles. We're like, whoa, this is not even similar. Like we're just saying this is how everything beneath us actually works.
Oh, wow.
Right, so there's this scarcity idea. You're starting from an abundance of things to a scarcity of things. Finally, the Higgs boson, which is supposedly one field, a unified field that permeates everything and allows everything to exist. So there's your idea of the good. So scarcity was a clue. The bold line of reality was a clue. I realized that you could cross reality in physics and you could cross reality in the Platonic model. And then the Higgs boson, of course, is the clue. It's been called the God particle for a reason. People were afraid it replaced the idea of God because it is the thing which allows all other things within the standard model. So there's just these three main parallels: the scarcity, the bold line of reality, and the idea of the good in the Higgs boson. Those three things were present in both systems, and that just clicked for me. Hey, these are mirror images.
Yeah, and it's really powerful that you were able to detect that. And I remember the first time Jacob and I heard it, it was a revolutionary idea to consider and then cross-apply to a bunch of different things.
Yeah.
And something I think Jacob and I both detected was a moral sort of framework in the Platonic ideas. And I'm curious if you think there's any sort of, can you impute any sort of moral framework on these particles and second and third and fourth generation particles, or is that just completely malleable?
Well, first I'll answer the question I didn't answer. The unified line, why is it called that?
Yes.
I was wondering.
This is a physics joke, okay? So a unified theory, or the unified field theory, to be even more specific, is this idea where people are trying to unify all the disparate parts of physics because physics does not agree with itself. Various realms of physics kind of disprove each other.
Oh, wow.
So there's this big effort to try and unify everything, and all current unification efforts, or unifications efforts up until this point, have definitely failed. So it's a physics joke. I'm saying, hey, I unified something.
I unified something. I don't know if it has anything to do with physics, but
That's
I
pretty
unified it with something.
It's actually a really
But
good
what
joke.
you unified it with is really some amazing stuff. And I don't know if the moral question I asked has any sort of bearing on this, but I just can't help seeing that moral framework in the pyramid-like structure. I see lots of triangles in this.
Yeah.
I see things geometrically.
I think Jacob might be able to
Yeah,
push into that a little.
absolutely.
Well, when you ask this moral question, we how do we pair possible actions with which we can say are good or bad onto this model that starts with images? I guess where I would go with this is there are ideas about actions, and at this lowest level, they're just ideas about actions. They're not the real actions. Now, we have in the New Testament Jesus teaching on the basically on the law, where he says even if you've thought something in your mind that's a sin, then even that's a sin. So that's kind of where I get this idea of even thoughts can have a moral component.
No.
And that's actually where I'd probably start with your moral question. On this first level, I'd say thoughts. And we don't know which are good or bad yet, but there can be plethoras of them. So that's where I'd start. Next, I'd go up to the actions. This is pretty straightforward. The second level, literal acts, deeds. If you can discretize them, then I think we're fine here. On the third row, you have to have some sort of precise model to describe the actions. And here's where we get tricky. What I'd say for this third row is you can almost like a puzzle piece insert in a moral theory. And so you might be a utilitarian.
Yeah.
So you could puzzle piece in here utilitarianism. That's the mathematically precise model which describes morality. Or you might be a Kantian. And so you might puzzle piece that in there.
Sure.
And based on that, you're going to have different answers to your game theoretic problems, which trickle down to your, observable actions, which trickle down to your thoughts. Okay.
So it's interesting that you say that, because then there's inherent in the next step that whatever the mathematical opinion is of what ideal morality is, there probably is an actual ideal morality.
Yeah, it's tricky though because whenever we do these models, it's harder and harder to actually describe the things on the higher levels. That's one thing we
it's
found.
easy to make mistakes and fall off into.
We found that so
absurdity.
much in our actual book club recording. If you go back, I listened to that this week. Whenever we talked about a new idea, we talked about several and tried to fit it into this model. Every time we got to this third, fourth, and then the ideal form, we got kind of tripped up on what the fourth and ideals are, especially. So, anyways, this ideal form of morality, I think it has to be something that fulfills all of the
Mathematical models.
something along those lines.
It has to explain everything beneath it.
It has to explain everything beneath it. That's right. And so I can talk kind of abstractly, almost philosophically, to sidestep the issue of
Sidestep away. This is the Positive Perspectives Philosophy Podcast. That's what we do.
Yeah. So I'll sidestep the issue of what moral theory is actually correct here by saying this ideal form has to be basically a principle that from which you can draw all of the actual realities of your moral theory. And then on this highest level is the essence of good, which is, shown in that ideal form principle, and then which trickles down to kind of the right modes of action described by the moral theory on the third level, and back down to actual actions on the second level, back down to thoughts on the last level. So that's my shot in the dark on this.
Often thought, and since you've answered this question from your perspective, I'm going to try to answer this from the artist's perspective, because Plato really gave a short shrift to artists.
Yeah.
I feel like he just was like, here, you're at the very bottom of the hierarchy. And I've often wondered if there's a way to quantify art from step to step. Like maybe there's like beauty is the higher form. Then you trickle down from there, and there's mathematical precision that goes into like the golden mean, perhaps.
Yeah, of course.
Then below that, it's actions, creating art well. Like not just creating it, but creating it well. And then maybe at the bottom, there's you were an appreciator. You were just looking at art. I don't know. That's just me shooting in the dark at that as well. But
that could be. I like that.
But back to Stephen here, because that's why we're here.
Our guest.
That's why we're here.
He did pass it off to me, so.
That's why we're here. Well, the big question I have is really, how can physics help us understand the meaning of life? Because Plato seemed to have built these frameworks to help us understand meaning. And I think physics can help us do that. I mean, I'm an optimist.
Sure.
As I've presented myself on this podcast and am in real life, I like to be optimistic. Do you think that physics can help us understand the meaning in existence?
Yes. Unverifiably, yes.
I love it when Stephen answers questions that way. Now, please tell us your feelings and your perspectives. That's why we're here. We want to know all the things you can't prove, your notions, your vague thoughts that fly in the dark at night, about how physics helps you understand the meaning of life. We want to know those things, the unscientific things.
You asked for it, so I will definitely say.
Sorry, the way Brandon asked that was just. It's hard to describe the interplay of the friendship going on here. Suffice to say, it's hard for us not to all just be laughing. In fact, I think we are. But anyway, sorry, go on.
All right, so hope for understanding the meaning of life. That's essentially where we're getting at, right?
Yeah, I just go straight to the questions that are...
Okay, here's what I would say. I think that physics, as well as the Platonic model, can help prove that there is a meaning to life. I'm not necessarily convinced it can tell us what the meaning of life is. Let me explain that a little bit. So if you subscribe to this idea that I've just pitched, that the Platonic model, which is a way of describing the universe, which essentially uses only logic and philosophy and thoughts, like cognition. It's just cognating a theory of the universe, a theory of everything. So if you subscribe to that, and then you look at the Standard Model, which is another kind of theory of everything, but it's a theory of everything built upon the scientific method, and it's in some ways the most prestigious achievement of the scientific method. And then you take those two things, the most prestigious achievement of, say, a mind, and then the most prestigious achievement of the scientific method, which is the culmination of millions of minds. And then you say, hey, look, they parallel each other exactly. I think that's a hint. That's a hint that, hey, there is something universal going on. There is something absolute going on. Relativism, swept the thought world over the past 150 years, and a lot of people don't like it. I probably don't like it much either, but I think this is a hint at something absolute.
While he was talking, you might have heard that word go off in your head that came up, and thank you for that answer. That really was a very moving answer. The word structure popped up from what he was saying.
We've talked about just that.
And I don't know if we can call that logos, but we can definitely say it's tough to look at the structure he just described and say absurd, absurd, absurd. It's tough to quantify the nature of existence as absurd when you say that, which is comforting.
Absolutely.
A point for the optimists.
Absolutely.
For the positivists.
The positivists.
For those positive perspectives.
Yes.
Yeah, just to draw that into our previous episodes, when we talked about Heraclitus and the idea of logos, when we talked about really everyone so far, the idea of structure being inherent upon men's minds has come up over and over. And for us to, as Stephen just described, go through the hardest, the greatest, the most intense of scientific processes and find structure that's common is just more evidence that there is, in fact, this underlying logic, structure, logos to our existence. And you're right. That does rebut relativism. It rebuts nihilism.
Yeah. The meaning of the structure and the meaning of that is then, difficult to ascertain. And I think that is the journey that all of us are on. And I hope that you will continue to walk with us on this journey and ask these questions with us and consider these questions. Many thanks to Stephen McClung for joining us today.
Very happy to be here.
It's been glad having you.
Yeah, thank you so much.
This has been the Positive Perspectives Philosophy Podcast with your hosts Jacob Murdoch and Brandon Moore.
Special guest, Stephen McClung.
Stephen McClung, signing off.